Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. I have not prepared formal remarks because I would like instead to offer ideas, suggestions, thoughts, reflections, and any answers to questions that you have that I might be able to answer. So in reviewing the drafted language that I was sent, that appears to be drafted for incorporation into the bill, there were a few things that I noticed that I would like to highlight for you all. And I'm actually going to start on one that you may not expect me to start on. I do not have the full redraft that you all have in front of you. I have the truncated portion, the Sheldon Amendment.
Okay. We have that too, so we can use that for you.
Okay, so from that document, I'm on page 5, line number 19. I'm sorry, line 14, which is section 6031 A3A1. And this is a provision that discusses ex parte communications and specifically the exceptions to the prohibition on ex parte communications. And this particular one, A3AI or A3A1, creates an exception where the district commission reasonably believes that no party will gain a procedural or tactical advantage as a result of the ex parte communication. I found that curious and would respectfully recommend that the committee consider striking or at very least modifying that. And the reason for it is because it is highly discretionary, highly subjective. And what it does not account for is implicit bias. It does not account for the fact that we are, by our very nature, fallible creatures, and that the Commission's reasonable belief that no tactical or procedural advantage might be gained doesn't mean there is no tactical or procedural advantage. I say that because oftentimes it is in ex parte communications, it is in quiet, closed rooms that so much business gets conducted. And oftentimes it is micro cues, social cues, that can direct us, often without our knowledge, toward one decision or another. In the interest of good governance, in the interest of transparency and fairness to all related parties, I do recommend the committee consider striking this because of its highly subjective and permissive nature. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, unless this is something that you all want me to discuss further, but it's just a small suggestion that I think.
Can you just, which part are you, not the whole thing, but
just that one,
certain words or that whole paragraph?
Actually, that whole paragraph.
Huh. Well, that would be interesting to consider. Okay, we'll consider that.
Yeah. All right. So on environmental justice.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. If we, some of this language, I'm looking at the main draft, and this is regarding your last comment. Some of that, the exception deals with just administrative issues, scheduling
Yes.
and that sort of thing.
I have no issue or position on that portion of it.
Okay, so it's getting at the that small I.
That small I, yes.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate the earlier comments of the representative and the previous witness with respect to considering the impact on Indigenous groups in Vermont, because when we think about land use and all of its related functions, we as government have the responsibility of having the humility to acknowledge that we're talking about how to use land that was never truly ours to begin with. And this is an important point because understanding that and acknowledging that openly helps to shape how we have conversations about land use in the future. So when we think about how and whether to approve permits or consider development in different parts of the state, community input and community perspective is so key. Now, I have to admit, because of my newness to the state, I am still wrapping my mind around 250 and everything that's in it. So I'm sure that there's a lot of gold in here that I have yet to discover. And I can assure you that in all my free time, this is what I'm doing.
Great. Do you want to join the committee?
So I do believe that there are other portions of the bill that perhaps I haven't seen yet that do speak to this. But I do still think that it's important for me to at least to say here that community perspective is going to be incredibly important, especially when we talk about racial equity. I think it's clear to everyone in the room that Vermont is set to be a receiver state for internally displaced persons in this country and for climate migrants. And so when we think about planning and land use, it's not just about who's here now or who has historically been here. It's also about who's going to be here, right? And we've seen demographic trends and predictions. We know that the future of Vermont is going to be a lot more diverse, and it's important that we start planning for that. Our towns will be a little bit denser. Our towns will be a little bit more colorful. And our towns are going to be living in an era where climate and technology are rapidly changing and very uncertain. I say all that to say that when we think about environmental justice, I think it's really important to codify community engagement strategies to make sure that we don't treat them as optional but as mandatory. Thinking about community engagement, we want it to be relational and respectful and receptive and responsive. And what that means is not just listening to the NIMBY crowds, but also listening to the perspectives of people who have historically been shut out of these conversations. We know, and I'm bouncing around a bit, and I should have said this at first. I'm prone to rambling, so you really have to cut me off. But we know that home ownership and land ownership are primary vehicles for intergenerational transfers of wealth. And we know that people of color have historically been shut out of housing and home ownership markets. So when we think about the intergenerational and the cumulative effects of this, what it creates is a picture where powerful and privileged people in dominant groups have tended to own the lands in question and decide how those lands get used. People outside of those dominant groups are often left to take what they're given, salud, or to accept whatever fate has been posted upon them. So in thinking about going forward, thinking about environmental justice, hearing from the community and being responsive to their needs is critical. That means having more direct communication with community. It means finding alternative methods of talking to them, right? Parenthood today looks very different than it did in the 50s. Our lives are so different now than they used to be. So making sure that government is reaching people where they are and being accessible to people in ways that people can get in touch with them. I give the example of Flint, Michigan, where limited English proficient or Spanish-speaking Flint residents were exposed to contaminated water for far longer than their English-speaking neighbors, simply because the city was not putting out enough Spanish language warnings and materials. And it also created a chilling effect for people, especially for the undocumented population in Flint, for being able to access the services they needed to combat what was happening. Now these are simple things. Translating a flyer sooner could have saved a lot of children, a lot of poisoning. But it was something that hadn't been considered, at least not adequately or quickly enough, by Flint officials and state officials. These are the kinds of things that we have to think about when we think about environmental justice, because it's not just, and I appreciate the definition that's included in here. I would gently suggest that we do expand it, and I appreciate the representative's comment about alternative definitions, because what I don't see in here, for example, is immigration status. What I don't see in here is socioeconomic status. What I don't see in here is a few other measures that help us as a state demonstrate that we're committed to equity for all. I forgot where I was going with this.
You were on an environmental justice thread.
Environmental justice,
that's
that's the
Michigan
definition.
example.
Oh dear.
The definition. And you said that it was easy to think about the translation
Yes.
of materials
Oh dear.
for
All right.
access.
In any event, thank you for that. In any event, so when we think about environmental justice, when we think about how we're reaching people, are we reaching people, it's really important that we consider that, you know, again, our demographics today look different than they did before. we know that in the United States, Latinos feel the effects of climate change more acutely than the general population does. 80% of our country's agricultural workers are Latino. They are twice as likely to die from asthma and related illness. And so when we think about who's vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and how we make decisions about permitting and development, it's important to consider all of those things. Again, thinking about places like Paradise, California, that is almost entirely burned down. And the biggest barrier to rebuilding there is not the impact of the fire, not the actual fire, but rather the fact that the PVC pipes underground all melted and leached toxic chemicals into the groundwater.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please stop me.
I don't want to stop you. But I do want your insight on our proposed criteria. It is N in the new document that we have. I don't know if you have that one.
I don't. I have
you
as
have it
far
in-
as M as in Mary.
Oh, it's,
M.
that's the one.
It's
That's the-
M.
okay.
Sorry,
In
got it,
that-
okay.
In that document, it turns out it's M.
Okay.
And I guess it's when it has been demonstrated by the applicant that, and I'm just curious if you could help inform, what does that mean? What would that mean to you? Is there a way for us to guide people in understanding what that demonstration might look like?
Yes, thank you. So I do think that it's important that if we ask the applicants to demonstrate that no group of people will bear disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences, that we have somebody who can check their work, so to speak. We know that oftentimes those applicants have financial vested interests in projects being approved. And so it's important that we have either government or third parties there to concurrently do those same kinds of studies. So I do recommend that we implement some kind of mechanism so that we can verify or fact check what we get back from applicants in that respect. But to your question, how do they demonstrate that? What would be things to look for? It means how many community consultations have they conducted? How many folks have they spoken to? Are they reaching people in multiple languages? Are they reaching multiple age demographics? Are they using data to inform their decision and their citing questions? If so, what data are they using? What kinds of timelines and metrics have they put in place to ensure compliance with other civil rights or other regulations? Frankly, which administration's regulations are they following? As we know, our national housing and urban development department has gone through myriad rule changes that have had negative impacts on people of color and people experiencing socioeconomic disparity. So do we go with rules that were solid in protecting those rights from previous administrations, or do we go with current iterations that may or may not survive court challenges? It also means that applicants should be able to demonstrate, and this is important, not just that groups aren't bearing disproportionate harm, but that they're also able to benefit equitably from any benefits that come from a project. Oftentimes when we think about environmental justice, we think about harm reduction and mitigation of negative impacts, but it's also about to whom are we conferring positive impacts, and how can we make that distribution more equitable as well. Give an example that I know personally. The jurisdiction that I'm coming from is New York City, and I mean, you have neighborhoods in New York that rank highest in the country for asthma prevalence because that's where we park all the buses at night. And that happens to be where Black and Latino people live more than others. You have neighborhoods that don't have a single homeless shelter, that don't have a single waste transfer facility, neighborhoods whose garbage gets carted to other neighborhoods. Those are wealthier neighborhoods that tend to have more white people living in them. This is an issue of environmental justice. Who gets more blacktop, which raises summer surface temperatures and increases heat-related illness and vulnerability? Who gets more green canopy and access to open areas, which contributes to better mental and physical health? When we think about applicants, when we ask applicants to demonstrate that no group of people will bear disproportionate shares of negative environmental consequences, it would also be great to hear from them how people are going to benefit equitably as well from their projects. Also, what defines a group? Do we have standard assessment criteria we would like them to conform to? Who checks their data, as I mentioned earlier? And are we factoring just who's currently here, again, or are we also thinking about who will be here in the future? And this is my demographer coming out. When we think about the population pyramid of Vermont, how many folks we have in different age brackets, different sexes, etc., are we planning for the future in a way that our projects are benefiting not just who's here, but also who we want to attract and retain?
Any questions, committee? You do?
I'd like to ask this question. Is there anything that I've said that either doesn't make sense or that you want to call BS on? I would love to be able to address that while I'm here with you, because sometimes I feel like I'm talking and I wonder if I've said anything, and so if there's anything that I've left confusing or not neatly tied up, I would be very happy to flesh out.
Sure.
How do you square economics with environmental justice? In terms of a lot of things what we wind up with is due to economics. It's not that it's trying to deny anyone environmental justice. So I'm wondering how you square the two.
That's an excellent question. I appreciate it. One of the things that I hear often in my work is, it's a similar argument. It's not quite the one that you're making, so I don't want to misattribute this to you. But one thing that I hear often is, well, it's not about race, it's about class, right? And of course, that's not borne out in the data. The data overwhelmingly tell us that race is a better predictor of life outcomes than socioeconomic status is. We even see it in the so-called 1%, where there's a huge disparity in earning for white children who grow up in the 1% versus black children who grow up in the 1%, a 12-point difference in life earnings. And then, of course, there is, well, we're not necessarily trying to deny people access or rights or what have you, but we can only afford what we can afford. And sometimes it might make better business sense to go one route, even if it has a socially disparate outcome, versus going another route that might cost us more but be more equitable. I respect that question because it addresses our financial and systemic limitations as a state. We can only afford what we can afford, and we only have as many builders and staffers and agencies as we have. However, I think that this is an opportunity for Vermont to live up to the reputation that we've all benefited from, that we're great, that we're tolerant, I really don't like that term, but that we're inclusive and welcoming, that we care about the outdoors, and that we care about the people who live here. It means that you have to make decisions based on more than just the business case. And again, I mean, there is a business case for equity and for inclusion, right? This is something that I speak about often, which is that you may not like inclusion for inclusion's sake, and that's fine. I'm not here to make people less racist. But if you want to be able to live in Vermont in 30 years, we need more people. There's a business case to be made for inclusion. And so when we think about what's it going to cost us to make equitable land use decisions, and is it worth it? Well, the answer is absolutely, just on moral grounds. But it's also worth it in the sense that we're investing in a future that we know is going to happen. We know Vermont's going to diversify, just like the rest of the country, perhaps a bit more slowly, but we'll get there. And so in thinking about what that future looks like and who that future looks like, it is absolutely a positive and a worthwhile investment of our time and our resources, because in the long run, we're setting ourselves up positively for success. There are lots of great places around the country to live if you want to ski and have great restaurants and be in a majority white state. There's lots of places to go for that. The thing that helps Vermont remain attractive to young people and to new people is that we put all of those people first. And so, what that means is that sometimes it's gonna cost us more to make equitable decisions, but that's something that we know we're gonna be able to live with. Also, I'm so sorry, also, I will say that, we perhaps could do better about leveraging other resources, right? Federal money, the Fed's always throwing money around, so I hear. You know, there's philanthropy, which is robust in Vermont. I think there are a lot of avenues that we could leverage what we have better so that we don't have to make those trade-offs between economics and environmental justice.
That was a break. I'm trying to think. So I don't know, and you may not know either, other states that have Act 250-like policies in their states. And what I'm getting at is best practices. So if we've had, I'm a realtor, so you know, there's an education to be had in, you know, loaning and redlining, you know, and all those types of things about that have racial, that have had in the past racial undertones that professions have tried to address over the years, and you know, there's you know, arguments to be had on both sides, I guess. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at is you know, best practices for this type of environmental justice. Do you know of any, or just off the top of your head, or you know, any kind of that would fit nicely into our Act 250 that are best practices from other states?
Well, I can name a few. These aren't things that I'm necessarily recommending to the committee, but things that I do think the committee can and should look at. You talked about redlining. You talked about loan discrimination and housing discrimination, and I appreciate that because so few people know about those practices. So few people know that in Vermont, historically, we had restrictive land covenants that said you can't sell this parcel to people of color, right? So in those avenues, there are some very simple and low-cost things that we could do. Things like having testers apply for loans, or you know, pose as home buyers to ensure that there's no unjustifiable discrimination happening in the market. It means that you can have certain requirements for small businesses. You may say, well, we're going to have a minimum threshold for how many small businesses a minimum target for green businesses, which obviously has its own land use impact and local economy impacts. I know the jurisdiction from which I'm coming, they have what's called mandatory inclusionary housing and MIH&CQA zoning for quality and affordability, which required that developers of residential buildings created a minimum number of units that would be quote unquote affordable. That is to say, that would be targeted for people below a certain percentage of AMI, annual median income. So, of course, there were loopholes around that. We had a lot of developers who said, okay, we're going to build this luxury condo tower, and we'll reserve 25% of units affordable, but we'll reserve them off-site so that the poors don't have to walk in the same entrance. So there are some things to consider. Vermont is quite different. Our housing stock is very old. It's centered around land ownership, single-family zoning. A lot of other jurisdictions have moved away from single-family zoning. Some of them have outright banned it. I don't necessarily advocate for that here in Vermont. Part of the reason I came to Vermont was to get away from dense housing. So perhaps that's a bit of a paradox I also have to answer to, but those are some practices. I'm very happy to follow up again with the committee with another list of things that are happening in other jurisdictions.
That's great. Thank you so much for coming.